The first thing you notice about Larrimah isn't the heat, though Christ, it'll knock you sideways if you're not ready for it, but the silence. Not the kind of quiet you get in the city when the traffic dies down, but something deeper. The kind of silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat and wonder if the rest of the world just forgot this place exists. I'd driven the 4 hours north from Katherine that morning, my ute kicking up red dust behind me. The Pink Panther pub sat at the end of the Stuart Highway's most forgotten stretch, its corrugated iron roof reflecting the merciless October sun. The hand-painted sign out front swayed in a wind that offered no relief. But Paddy Moriarty wasn't there. His blue Holden ute sat in its usual spot beside the pub, keys still dangling from the ignition. The driver's side door hung open like a mouth frozen mid-sentence. Kellie's water bowl sat empty on the pub's front steps, the metal so hot it would have branded your palm. "He's been gone 3 days now," said Fran Hodgins, wrapping her weathered hands around a lukewarm beer. She ran the pub with the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that comes from 30 years of dealing with truckers, tourists, and the handful of locals who called this dust bowl home. Just vanished, him and that bloody dog of his. The locals had already gathered, as they did every evening when the heat became merely unbearable instead of deadly. Barry Sharp sat in his usual corner, his massive frame folded into a chair that groaned under his weight. Cookie Barbagallo leaned against the bar, his chef's apron stained with grease and what looked like beetroot. They all wore the same expression, half concern, half fascination. In a town of 11 people, a disappearance was the biggest thing to happen since the railway closed. "Paddy wouldn't just leave," I said, accepting a beer that was more warm than cold. "Not without telling someone." Fran's laugh held no humor. "You don't know Paddy as well as you think, mate. I'd known Patrick Paddy Moriarty for 15 years, ever since I'd started making regular runs through Larrimah as a freelance journalist covering the territory's remote communities. He was 70 years old, built like a wire fence post, with hands that told the story of decades spent fixing machinery and mending fences. His border collie Kellie was never more than 10 feet away, her black and white coat somehow staying clean despite the omnipresent dust. The Pink Panther had been Paddy's second home, the place where he'd hold court, with stories about his days as a head stockman on cattle stations across the top end. He had opinions about everything: politics, weather, the best way to skin a buffalo, and he wasn't shy about sharing them. Some folks found him abrasive. I found him honest in a way that was becoming rare. But Paddy had his dark moments too. I remembered one evening 6 months ago, when he'd cornered me outside the pub after a few too many beers. "This place is dying," he'd said, his eyes red-rimmed and distant. "Every year fewer people stop by, fewer reasons to stay." He'd paused, watching a road train disappear into the darkness down the Stuart Highway. "Sometimes I think about just walking out into the scrub one morning. See how far I can get before the country claims me." At the time I'd chalked it up to alcohol and loneliness. Now, with his empty ute sitting in the pub's car park, those words carried a different weight. But there were other memories too. Like the afternoon Kellie had gotten into a fight with Barry Sharp's cattle dog, and Paddy had driven 40 kilometers to Katherine just to get her treated by the vet. He'd spent $300 he couldn't afford on antibiotics and bandages, then hand-fed her for a week until she was strong enough to eat on her own. "That dog saved my life more than once," he'd told me. "Least I can do is return the favor." The idea of Paddy abandoning Kellie, alive or dead, didn't fit with the man I knew. "When's the last time anyone saw him?" I asked. Cookie straightened up, wiping his hands on his apron. "Sunday arvo. He was here having a countermeal, going on about the council and their bloody regulations. Same old Paddy, you know, complaining about this and that." "What kind of regulations?" "The usual, red tape about his property, something about his sheds not being up to code." Cookie's eyes flicked toward Barry Sharp, who was studying his beer like it held the secrets of the universe. He was pretty wound up about it. Barry looked up, his face flushed red above his gray beard. "I'm just doing my job. Council says something needs inspecting, I inspect it. Not my fault if people don't like what I find." The tension in the room thickened like humidity before a wet season storm. This wasn't just about missing persons anymore. In a town this small, every conversation carried the weight of old grudges and unspoken resentments. I'd heard the stories over the years, how Barry and Paddy's feud had escalated from neighborly disputes to something uglier. property lines, water rights, accusations of cattle theft. The kind of conflicts that could simmer for decades in isolated communities, growing more toxic with each perceived slight. Did he say where he was going after dinner? I pressed. Home, I reckon, Fran said. He never stays out late, always worried about Kellie getting too hot if she's left in the car. That detail struck me wrong. Paddy treated that dog better than most people treated their children. He'd built a special cooling system in his ute, just to keep her comfortable during the hot months. The idea of him abandoning her, even temporarily, didn't fit. I finished my beer and stood up. I'm going to take a look at his place. Police already been through it, Barry said. Constable came down from Catherine yesterday, didn't find nothing unusual. Won't hurt to have another look. The sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and red, as I drove the half-kilometre to Paddy's property. His house was a modest weatherboard structure with a wraparound veranda, the kind of building that had weathered decades of cyclones and dry seasons with stubborn persistence. Solar panels glinted on the roof, and a satellite dish pointed toward some distant star. Everything looked normal. Too normal. The front door was unlocked. Nobody bothered with security out here, and I stepped into the dim interior. The air was stifling, heavy with the smell of dust and cooking oil. Paddy's breakfast dishes sat clean and dry beside the sink. His bed was made with military precision. A week's worth of newspapers lay folded neatly on the kitchen table, but there were subtle signs of disruption too. A chair in the living room sat slightly askew, as if someone had gotten up quickly and forgotten to push it back into place. The telephone cord was stretched taut across the hallway, suggesting the handset had been dropped or yanked. In the kitchen, I found something that made my blood run cold. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the counter, the bread dried and curling at the edges. Beside it, a cup of tea with a skin of mold floating on the surface. Paddy was fastidious about cleaning up after himself. He would never have left food sitting out to rot. In the backyard, I found Kellie's favorite stick beside her kennel, worn smooth from years of fetching. Her food bowl was full, the kibble untouched and stale. Flies buzzed around a water dish that had evaporated to a muddy residue in the bottom. I was photographing the scene with my phone when I heard a vehicle approaching. Through the window, I watched a white Toyota pull into the driveway. The door slammed and heavy footsteps crossed the veranda. "Thought I might find you here," said Detective Senior Constable Kate Morrison. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of tan that came from outdoor work rather than beach holidays. Her uniform was crisp despite the heat, and her eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the room. "Just having a look around," I said. "I'm a friend of Paddy's." "So I heard. Fran told me you'd be sniffing around." She didn't make it sound like a compliment. "This is a police investigation now. I'll need you to step outside." I followed her onto the veranda, where the evening air felt cool after the stifling house. "Any leads?" Morrison studied me for a long moment, as if deciding how much to share. Patrick Moriarty was last seen Sunday evening at approximately 7 p.m. leaving the Pink Panther pub. His vehicle was discovered Monday morning by Barry Sharp, who was conducting a council inspection of the property. "What kind of inspection?" "Building compliance." Apparently, Mr. Moriarty had some unpermitted structures on his land. Morrison's tone was carefully neutral, but I caught the implication. There'd been some back and forth between him and the council over the past few months. Enough to make him want to disappear, or enough to make someone else want him to disappear. The words hung in the air between us as the sun finally touched the horizon. In the distance, a wedge-tailed eagle circled lazily, riding the thermals that rose from the baked earth. Only the Stewart Highway hummed in the distance. A thin ribbon of bitumen that went on and on. "I'm organizing a proper search tomorrow morning," Morrison said. "If you want to help, meet at the pub at 6 a.m. Bring water, hat and decent boots. The scrubland out here will chew you up if you're not careful." I nodded, already planning what gear to pack. "You think he's still alive?" Morrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. "In this heat? After 4 days?" "I'm hoping we find answers. That's all I'm hoping for." The search party assembled in the Pink Panther's car park, as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Morrison had called in additional resources from Catherine, 2 more constables, and a volunteer search and rescue coordinator named Jeff Grimm. He was a weathered man in his 60s, who'd spent most of his life tracking cattle and lost tourists through the territory's most unforgiving country. "We'll work in pairs," Grim announced, spreading a topographical map across the bonnet of his Land Cruiser. "Radio contact every 30 minutes. Nobody goes more than 2 kilometers from base without checking in. The country out here looks empty, but there's a dozen ways it can kill you if you're not paying attention." Besides the police, the search party included most of Larrimah's permanent residents. Fran had closed the pub to join us, her face grim with determination. Cookie carried a GPS unit and enough water for 3 people. Even Barry Sharp had volunteered, though he kept to himself and avoided eye contact with the others. A new face had joined us too, Owen Laurie, a lean man in his 50s who ran cattle on a property northeast of town. I'd seen him around over the years, but had never spoken to him at length. He wore a faded red shirt that had seen better days, and his boots were caked with the kind of mud that only comes from working creek beds during the dry season. I was paired with Owen for the search. He knew the country better than anyone except possibly Paddy himself. "If Paddy wandered off on foot, he wouldn't have gone far," Owen said, as we set off toward a line of scrubby hills to the west. "He's smart about the bush, but he's 70 years old. This heat would have knocked him around pretty quick." We walked in companionable silence, scanning the red dirt for any sign of passage. The landscape looked deceptively simple: sparse grass, scattered shrubs, the occasional ghost gum casting thin shade. But I soon realized it was full of subtle variations that meant the difference between finding someone and losing them forever. Owen moved through the country with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent decades reading the land. He pointed out animal tracks, identified plants by their leaf patterns, and seemed to know instinctively which areas were worth searching and which were too exposed for a person to survive. "Paddy and I had a drink together last month," Owen said during a water break. "He was talking about his dog, how she was getting old and might not have many years left. Said he didn't know what he'd do without her. Man gets that attached to an animal, he doesn't just walk away from it." An hour into the search, Owen stopped beside a dry creek bed that meandered through a stand of bloodwood trees. The sandy bottom showed the tracks of several animals: kangaroos, wild pigs, and something smaller that might have been a dog. "Here," Owen said, kneeling beside a depression in the sand. "Look at this." The print was partially obscured by wind and animal tracks, but the pattern was unmistakably human. A boot print, size 10 or 11, pointing west into the scrub. "Could be anyone," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I remembered Paddy's feet. He'd always worn the same brand of work boots, heavy leather things that had molded to his feet over years of wear. Owen was already following the creek bed, his eyes scanning the ground with practiced efficiency. "There," he said, pointing to another print 20 meters upstream. "And there." A trail began to emerge, faint but consistent. Someone had walked this way recently, following the creek bed west toward a range of low hills that shimmered in the distance like a mirage. We radioed our position to Morrison and pressed on, the prints leading us deeper into country that looked increasingly hostile. The temperature was already climbing toward 40 degrees, and the sun hammered down with the intensity of a blast furnace. Sweat soaked through my shirt within minutes, and I found myself rationing my water despite carrying 3 liters. Owen seemed less affected by the heat, moving with steady persistence across terrain that left me gasping. Every few hundred meters, he'd stop and study the ground, occasionally pointing out a scuff mark or a broken twig that suggested recent passage. "Whoever made these tracks was moving fast," he said. "See how deep the toe prints are? That's someone pushing hard, maybe running." The trail led us up a rocky slope covered in spinifex grass that grabbed at our legs like barbed wire. At the crest of the hill, Owen stopped suddenly and pointed to a cluster of granite boulders about 100 meters to our north. "There's something there," he said. We approached carefully, the silence broken only by our labored breathing and the distant cry of a crow. The boulders formed a natural shelter, the kind of place a person might seek shade during the worst heat of the day. What we found made my blood go cold. Scattered among the rocks were the unmistakable signs of violence. A torn piece of blue fabric, the same color as the shirt Paddy had been wearing when he disappeared, hung from a thorny bush. Dark stains marked the rocks, too old to be fresh blood, but too recent to have weathered away completely. And there, half buried in the sandy soil beneath the largest boulder, was a work boot. Size 11. The leather was scuffed and worn, the sole worn smooth in the pattern of a man who'd spent his life on his feet. Owen reached for his radio with shaking hands. "Base, this is Search Team 4, we've found something, you need to get out here now." I stared at the boot, my mind racing through the implications. Paddy hadn't just wandered off and gotten lost. Someone had brought him here, to this remote place where the rocks could hide secrets and the silence could swallow screams. The question was no longer what had happened to Paddy Moriarty. The question was, who had done it, and why? And somewhere in the back of my mind, a darker question began to form. Were we looking for evidence of a crime, or were we walking into a trap? Morrison arrived within an hour, along with 2 constables from Catherine and a crime scene photographer. They cordoned off the area, with tape that fluttered in the desert wind like prayer flags. The tape marked the boundary between what we knew and what we feared. The boot was carefully bagged, along with the fabric and soil samples from the dark stains, but even as they worked, I found my thoughts drifting to the people back in town. In a community of 11 people, the killer was almost certainly someone I'd shared a beer with, someone who'd looked me in the eye and expressed concern for Paddy's welfare. Barry Sharp remained the obvious suspect. Barry lived on the property adjacent to Paddy's, separated by a fence line that had been the source of bitter disputes for over a decade. The feud had started small: complaints about Paddy's dog barking, arguments over water rights, accusations about cattle wandering onto the wrong side of the fence. But it had escalated over the years, into something uglier, more personal. I'd heard the stories from Fran at the pub, late-night shouting matches, threats made in town when both men had been drinking. Barry's frequent calls to the local authorities about everything from noise complaints to alleged property damage. The most serious incident had occurred just 6 months ago. Barry claimed Paddy had deliberately poisoned a boar on his land, killing 3 of his cattle. Paddy denied it, but Barry had made his feelings clear to anyone who'd listen. "That bastard's cost me thousands. One day he's going to get what's coming to him." But there were other possibilities too. Cookie had mentioned debts, money that Paddy owed around town. Fran herself had been carrying his tab at the pub for months. In desperate places, people sometimes killed for surprisingly small amounts of money. And then there was Owen. I watched him as he answered Morrison's questions, noting how composed he seemed despite the grisly discovery. Most people would have been shaken by finding evidence of violence. Owen appeared almost professional. "You did good work tracking those prints," Morrison told him. "Not many people could have followed a trail that faint," Owen shrugged. "Spent enough time looking for lost cattle over the years. You learn to read the country." But something nagged at me about Owen's explanation. The boot we'd found was clean, almost pristine despite being half buried in the dirt. If it had been there since Paddy's disappearance 4 days ago, it should have shown more weathering. More importantly, the area around the boulder showed signs of recent disturbance. Someone had been digging here lately, and the work looked fresh. By the time we returned to Larrimah, word of our discovery had spread through the town like wildfire. I found Barry at the general store, loading supplies into his ute with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd done the same routine for years. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders and chest, with hands scarred from decades of farm work and a face weathered to leather by the sun. "Barry," I called out as he hefted a bag of feed into the truck bed. "Got a minute?" He straightened slowly, his pale blue eyes fixing on mine with undisguised suspicion. "Heard you fellas found something out in the scrub. About time someone started taking this seriously. Where were you 3 nights ago, the night Paddy disappeared?" Barry's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Christ, you don't waste time, do you? 3 nights ago, I was exactly where I am every night, on my property, minding my own business. Unlike some people in this town, I don't spend my evenings drinking myself stupid at the pub. Anyone who can verify that, my cattle can verify it, my dogs can verify it. But I suppose that's not good enough for you." He slammed the tailgate shut with more force than necessary. "You want to know what I think happened to Paddy Moriarty? I think he finally picked a fight with the wrong person. Man makes enough enemies, eventually one of them fights back. Sounds like you're speaking from experience." Barry's face darkened. "That son of a bitch cost me 3 head of cattle. Good breeding stock. You know what that represents in lost income. But I didn't need to kill him over it. Time and the bottle were going to do that job for me." I watched his hands as he spoke, Big, powerful hands that could easily overpower an aging alcoholic. The boot we found, Barry. It's going to be tested for DNA. If Paddy's blood is on it, then whoever killed him was stupid enough to leave evidence. His voice was steady, but I caught the slight tremor in his left hand as he reached for his keys. Look, I'm not going to pretend I liked Paddy. We had our differences, and he was a stubborn old fool who couldn't mind his own business. But I've got a property to run and problems enough of my own without adding murder to the list. He climbed into his ute and started the engine, rolling down the window as the diesel settled into its familiar rumble. You want some advice? Look closer to home. Paddy had debts all over town, and Fran's been carrying him at the pub for months. Man disappears owing money to half the territory. That's not a coincidence. As Barry drove away, leaving me standing in a cloud of red dust, I couldn't shake the feeling that his performance had been just that, a performance. The anger seemed genuine enough, but there was something calculated about it, as if he'd been rehearsing his responses. Yet his alibi, thin as it was, would be almost impossible to disprove. In a place like Larrimah, a man could disappear into his own property for days without anyone noticing. I was heading back to the pub when my phone rang. Morrison's voice crackled through the static. We've got a problem. That boot? It's not Paddy's. Wrong size, wrong brand. Whoever it belonged to had smaller feet and better taste in footwear. The discovery should have been a relief, but instead it left me more unsettled than before. If the boot wasn't Paddy's, whose was it? And what did its presence at the scene mean? Was someone else involved, or had we stumbled onto evidence of an entirely different crime? I spent the evening at the Pink Panther, nursing a beer and listening to the locals dissect every detail of our search. Fran worked behind the bar with grim efficiency, her usual cheerfulness replaced by a tension that seemed to infect the entire room. Cookie sat in his usual spot near the window, occasionally muttering observations that nobody seemed to hear. And in the corner, Owen traced patterns in the condensation on his glass, his eyes distant and troubled. It's not right, Fran said during a lull in conversation. A man doesn't just vanish, not Paddy. He might have been a lot of things, but he wasn't the type to run off without his dog. Maybe he didn't have a choice, Owen replied quietly. Maybe someone made the choice for him. The words hung in the air like smoke, and I found myself studying the faces around me with new suspicion. How well did any of us really know each other? In a town of 11 people, secrets should have been impossible to keep. But the territory was vast, and it was surprisingly easy for a person to maintain privacy when their nearest neighbor lived kilometers away. That night, I lay awake in the swag I'd rolled out behind the pub, staring up at a sky so brilliant with stars it seemed like a ceiling of diamonds. The temperature had dropped into the teens, and the silence was so complete, it felt oppressive. Somewhere out there, Paddy Moriarty's body might be decomposing under that same sky. And his killer was sleeping peacefully, confident that the secret would stay buried in the red dirt. I was drifting towards sleep when I heard it, the distant sound of a vehicle engine, running without lights, somewhere to the west of town. The sound faded quickly, but it left me wide awake and listening. Who would be driving around Larrimah at 2 a.m, and why would they do it? In darkness? The next morning brought answers I wasn't prepared for. Morrison called just after dawn, her voice tight with urgency. We need to talk. There's been a development. I met her at the police station in Catherine, a 2-hour drive that gave me plenty of time to imagine the worst. Morrison looked like she hadn't slept, her uniform wrinkled, and her eyes bloodshot. We found Paddy's truck, she said without preamble. Abandoned in a dry riverbed, about 40 kilometers south of town. Keys were still in it, but it had been wiped clean. No prints, no trace evidence, nothing. How long has it been there? Hard to say. Could have been days, could have been weeks. But here's the thing. It didn't break down, and it didn't get stuck. Someone drove it there deliberately and left it. She led me to a table covered with photographs of the truck and its surroundings. The vehicle looked oddly small and vulnerable, sitting alone in the vast landscape. Like a child's toy abandoned in a sandbox. There's more, Morrison continued. We found tire tracks leading away from the scene, 2 sets, one matching Paddy's truck, and another from a larger vehicle. A 4-wheel drive, probably a ute or a big SUV. Someone followed him out there, or led him out there, and then drove him back. The implications were clear and disturbing. Paddy hadn't driven himself to that remote riverbed, at least not alone. Someone had orchestrated his disappearance with careful planning, choosing a location far from any traveled road where the truck might sit unnoticed for months. Any idea who in town drives a vehicle that might match those tracks? Morrison's expression was grim. That's where it gets complicated. Half the people in Larrimah drive something that could have made those marks. Barry Sharp has a Toyota Hilux. Fran drives a Nissan Patrol. Even Owen's got an old Land Cruiser he uses for supply runs. I thought about the vehicle I'd heard the night before, running dark through the scrubland. Had someone been moving evidence, or had they been checking on something they'd hidden? "There's something else," Morrison said, producing another photograph from the stack. "We found this caught on a tree branch about a kilometer from where the truck was abandoned." The photograph showed a small piece of red cloth, bright against the gray-green of desert scrub. It looked like it had been torn from a shirt or jacket, snagged as someone pushed through heavy brush. "Paddy was wearing blue when he disappeared," I said. "That's right. So either someone else was involved, or this belongs to his killer." I studied the photograph, trying to place where I might have seen that particular shade of red recently. It was distinctive, not the faded red of old work clothes, but a brighter color that had weathered to a dusty pink. The kind of red that would stand out in a crowd, even in a town as small as Larrimah. And then it hit me. Owen had been wearing a red shirt during our search. I remembered noticing it because the color had seemed too bright for the grim circumstances. But red was a common color, and plenty of people owned red clothing. Still, the thought nagged at me as I drove back toward Larrimah. Owen had been helpful, almost eager to join the search effort. But wasn't that exactly what someone might do if they wanted to control the flow of information? Stay close to the investigation, learn what evidence had been found. Maybe even influence where people looked and what conclusions they drew. I was so lost in thought that I almost missed the turnoff for the old mining track that ran parallel to the main highway. It was a route that locals sometimes used as a shortcut, though it required a four-wheel drive and some nerve to navigate the rough terrain. As I passed the turnoff, something caught my eye: fresh tire tracks leading into the bush, and the glint of sunlight on metal somewhere among the trees. I pulled over and grabbed the binoculars from my glove box. Through the lenses, I could make out the distinctive shape of a vehicle parked deep in the scrub. Almost invisible from the road, it was Owen's Land Cruiser. My heart began to pound as I considered my options. I could call Morrison, but by the time she arrived, Owen might be gone. I could drive back to town and confront him there, but if he was involved in Paddy's disappearance, that might spook him into running. Or I could investigate on my own, though every instinct I possessed warned me against going into the bush alone. In the end, curiosity won over caution. I turned onto the mining track and followed it slowly, trying to keep my own tire noise to a minimum. The Land Cruiser was parked in a small clearing, about 2 kilometers from the road, hidden behind a stand of ghost gums that provided perfect camouflage. I stopped my vehicle well back and approached on foot, moving carefully through the sparse undergrowth. The clearing showed signs of recent activity. Someone had been digging, using a shovel to excavate a hole about 2 meters long and half as wide. The red earth was piled beside the excavation like a wound in the landscape. And the smell of disturbed soil hung heavy in the still air. Owen was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear sounds coming from somewhere deeper in the scrub. The scrape of metal on stone, the soft thud of earth being moved. He was still digging. I followed the sounds, my mouth dry with fear and anticipation. Whatever Owen was burying, it was important enough for him to risk discovery. Important enough to bring him out here in broad daylight, despite the ongoing police investigation. I found him in another small clearing, this one hidden by a ring of boulders that provided natural concealment. He was working methodically, his red shirt dark with sweat, as he deepened what looked like a grave. Beside the hole, wrapped in a blue tarp, was a bundle about the size and shape of a human body. For a moment I couldn't move. The reality of what I was seeing seemed to overwhelm my ability to process it. Owen. Quiet, helpful Owen, who joined our search parties and offered theories about Paddy's disappearance, was burying a body in the remote bush. I tried to back away quietly, planning to retreat to my vehicle and call Morrison. But my foot caught on a dead branch, sending it skittering across the rocky ground with a noise that seemed to echo like a gunshot. Owen straightened immediately, his eyes finding mine across the clearing. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. An expression of resigned acceptance, as if he'd been expecting this moment and had already decided how it would end. "Well," he said, setting down his shovel with deliberate care, "I suppose we need to talk." I fumbled for my phone, trying to activate the voice recorder without taking my eyes off Owen. "Why, Owen? Why did you kill him?" Owen wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of red dirt across his skin. "You really want to know? Or are you just buying time while you figure out how to get out of this alive?" "I want to know." He gestured toward the tarp-wrapped bundle. "Paddy killed my dog. Poisoned her with baits he put out for wild pigs. Said it was an accident, but I knew better. He was always complaining about noise, about cattle getting through the fence. So he decided to solve the problem his own way. I thought about the boar poisoning that Barry had mentioned, the dead cattle that had started the feud between him and Paddy. That was you, the cattle that died on Barry's property. You poisoned them to frame Paddy." Owen nodded slowly. 3 head. Drove them onto Barry's land and gave them enough strychnine to kill a buffalo. Figured if Paddy was going to play dirty, I could play dirtier. But it didn't work. Police couldn't prove anything, and Paddy just kept making life difficult. He picked up the shovel again, testing its weight in his hands. So when I saw him walking his dog along the creek that evening, I decided to have a conversation. Face to face, man to man, tell him how I felt about what he'd done. And he laughed, actually laughed at me. Said if I was stupid enough to let my dog wander onto his property, I deserved whatever happened to her. Owen's knuckles went white around the shovel handle. That's when I hit him. Didn't plan it, didn't think about it, just swung. The dog tried to protect him, so I had to deal with her too. I felt sick, imagining Kellie trying to defend her master against a man with a shovel. Then what? Then I panicked. Loaded them both into my truck and drove them deep into the bush. Figured the dingoes and pigs would take care of the evidence. But when the search party started up, I got worried. Decided to move them somewhere more permanent. He gestured toward the half-dug grave. Should have done this from the beginning. Would have saved us both a lot of trouble. My phone felt slippery in my sweating palm, but I kept the recorder running. "The boot we found yesterday, that was yours. Lost it pulling Paddy's body out of the first grave. Didn't realize until I got home. By then, it was too late to go back for it." Owen stepped closer, and I instinctively backed away. "You know I can't let you leave here, right? Not after what you've seen. Morrison knows where I am. If I don't check in, Morrison knows you were heading back to Larrimah. She doesn't know about this place. And by the time anyone thinks to look for you, there'll be 3 bodies in this hole instead of 2. I looked around desperately for something I could use as a weapon. The clearing was surrounded by boulders, but nothing within reach was small enough to throw or swing effectively. Owen seemed to read my thoughts. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. I'll make it quick." Just like I did for Paddy. That's when I realized he was wrong about one thing. Morrison didn't know exactly where I was, but my phone's GPS did, and I'd been broadcasting our conversation to the emergency services through the voice recorder app. If the signal was getting through, help might already be on the way. I just had to stay alive long enough for it to arrive. "You know what your problem is, Owen?" I said, backing slowly toward the largest boulder. "You're not as smart as you think you are." He frowned, momentarily confused by my apparent calm. "The tire tracks at Paddy's truck, the red fabric, even that convenient boot you left behind. You've been leaving a trail of evidence that leads right back to you. Morrison's already figured it out. She's probably on her way here right now." Owen's expression darkened. "You're lying." "Am I? How else do you think I found this place? You think I just happened to drive by and spot your truck?" I could see doubt creeping into his eyes, and I pressed my advantage. "They've been watching you, Owen. Waiting for you to lead them to the bodies, and you've just given them everything they need." That's when he snapped. Owen came at me with the shovel raised above his head, his face twisted with rage and desperation. I rolled behind the boulder just as the blade crashed into the rock where my head had been. Chips of granite flew like shrapnel, and the impact sent vibrations through the stone. "You bastard!" he screamed, raising the shovel for another swing. "You've ruined everything." I scrambled to my feet and ran, with Owen close behind. The scrubland that had seemed so barren during our search now became my salvation. Every bush provided potential cover, every rock offered a moment's concealment, but Owen knew this country better than I did, and he was driven by the desperate fury of a man with nothing left to lose. The chase lasted maybe 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the undergrowth and cursing as he struggled to keep up. My lungs burned from the heat and exertion, and my water was long gone. Finally, I stumbled and went down hard, skinning my knees on the rocky ground. Owen was on me before I could get up, the shovel whistling through the air toward my skull. I rolled aside at the last second, and the blade buried itself in the dirt beside my ear. As Owen struggled to free the shovel, I grabbed a rock about the size of a cricket ball and swung it with every ounce of strength I had left. It caught him in the temple with a sound like a branch breaking. Owen dropped like a felled tree, blood pooling beneath his head as he lay motionless on the red dirt. For a long moment I just sat there gasping for breath and trying to process what had happened. Then I heard the distant sound of helicopters approaching from the south. Morrison had received my emergency broadcast after all. Help was finally on the way. The aftermath unfolded like a slow-motion car crash that no one could stop watching. Morrison arrived with backup just as the sun was setting, painting the clearing in shades of blood and gold. They found me still sitting beside Owen's body, the rock that had killed him lying in the dirt between us. And nearby, the blue tarp containing what we all knew were Paddy's remains. The investigation that followed was thorough but somehow felt hollow. Owen's death was ruled self-defense, the evidence supported my account of events, and his own confession recorded on my phone left little room for doubt. But justice felt incomplete when the perpetrator was already dead, buried in the same red earth where he'd tried to hide his victim. The media descended on Larrimah like locusts, transforming our tiny settlement into a circus of camera crews and sensation-hungry reporters. For weeks, you couldn't turn on the television without seeing aerial shots of the Pink Panther pub, or hearing some journalist mispronounce local place names while breathlessly recounting the Outback murder mystery. Cookie was in her element, holding court with reporters and embellishing details with each retelling. By her third interview, Paddy had been a war hero, and Owen a deranged drifter who'd threatened half the town. The truth was both simpler and more complex than her stories. But the truth rarely made for good television. Barry struggled more with the attention. I found him one morning sitting outside his museum, staring at a tour bus that had stopped to gawk at the crime scene. The tourists were taking selfies with the Pink Panther pub in the background, their faces bright with morbid excitement. "This isn't what Paddy would have wanted," he said without looking at me. "All this fuss and carry on, he just wanted to be left alone with his dog and his beer." I wanted to comfort him, but Barry was right. There was something obscene about the carnival atmosphere that had descended on our community. Paddy's death had become entertainment, his life reduced to a dramatic storyline that would be forgotten as soon as the next story came along. The physical evidence told a clear story, once we knew how to read it. Owen had killed Paddy in a moment of rage during their confrontation about the dog poisoning. The argument had escalated beyond words, and Owen had struck out with the shovel. Kellie had died trying to protect her master, and Owen had panicked, loading both bodies into his vehicle and driving them deep into the bush. The original burial site was never found. Owen had been moving the remains when I discovered him, probably spooked by the increased police presence. Worried that his initial hiding place might be compromised, in trying to be cleverer, he'd exposed himself and sealed his fate. What haunted me most wasn't Owen's violence, terrible as it was, but his ability to maintain the deception for so long. He'd searched alongside us, had eaten Cookie's sandwiches and shared our theories about what might have happened. He'd looked me in the eye and suggested we expand the search area, knowing full well that Paddy's body was buried somewhere in the scrubland we were combing. The psychological evaluation conducted posthumously revealed a pattern of childhood abuse and social isolation that might have explained Owen's actions. But explanations felt inadequate when weighed against the finality of death. Understanding why someone commits murder doesn't resurrect the victim or comfort those left behind. The town began to change in subtle ways. Doors that had never known locks suddenly sprouted security hardware. Conversations became guarded when strangers appeared. The easy trust that had characterized our remote community was replaced by a wariness that felt foreign and unwelcome. Some residents left altogether. the young woman who'd been working at the roadhouse packed up and moved to Darwin, telling anyone who'd listen that she couldn't stay in a place where people could disappear without anyone noticing for days. An elderly couple who'd retired to Larrimah for its peace and quiet sold their property and relocated to Alice Springs, deciding that urban anonymity was preferable to rural isolation. But others doubled down on community, as if strengthening our bonds could prevent future tragedies. A neighborhood watch program was established, though what it was supposed to watch for in a town of 11 people remained unclear. Monthly barbecues were organized, mandatory affairs where attendance was noted and absences questioned. Cookie threw herself into documenting Larrimah's history, as if creating a complete record could somehow protect us from future mysteries. She interviewed every long-term resident about their memories of the settlement, recording hours of stories about characters and events that predated my arrival. The project gave her purpose and the rest of us a sense that our community's story was worth preserving, even if recent chapters had been dark. Morrison visited regularly in the months that followed, checking on the community's well-being, but also, I suspected, trying to understand how she'd missed the signs of Owen's instability. The detective struck me as someone who took failure personally, and Owen's deception represented a professional blind spot that would likely haunt Morrison for years to come. The thing about small communities, she told me during one visit, is that everyone thinks they know everyone else, but people are mysteries, even to themselves sometimes. Owen probably didn't wake up that morning planning to kill anyone. The comment was meant to be reassuring, but it had the opposite effect. If Owen's violence had been premeditated, it would have been easier to understand, and therefore easier to guard against. The idea that ordinary frustration could escalate into murder in a matter of moments was far more terrifying than any calculated evil. Winter came early that year, bringing cold nights and clear skies that stretched endlessly above our tiny settlement. I found myself spending more time at the Pink Panther pub, not because I enjoyed Cookie's increasingly elaborate theories about other local mysteries, but because the alternative was sitting alone with my thoughts and the memory of Owen's smile in that clearing. The pub became an informal therapy session, though we never acknowledged it as such. Barry would nurse a single beer all evening while Cookie held court behind the bar. And we'd talk about everything except the obvious: how Paddy's death had changed us, and whether Larrimah would ever feel safe again. Some nights, travelers would stop by, drawn by the media coverage and hungry for details about the murder. Cookie accommodated them with gusto, but Barry and I learned to recognize the signs. We'd quietly slip away before the questioning began. There was something voyeuristic about their interest that felt like a violation of Paddy's memory. I thought about him often, not the victim of Owen's violence, but the cantankerous old man who'd argued with everyone and loved his dog more than most people love their families. His absence left a hole in our community that went beyond mere numbers. Paddy had been our designated curmudgeon, the one who complained about changes and resisted progress, and generally made life more difficult for everyone around him. Without him, we were somehow diminished. The months passed, and gradually the media attention faded. The tour buses stopped coming, and the reporters moved on to other stories. Larrimah began to resemble its former self, at least on the surface. But underneath we all carried the knowledge of what had happened here, and that knowledge changed everything. Spring returned with its brutal heat and sudden storms. I found myself driving the back roads again, not searching for anything specific but unable to shake the habit of looking. The landscape that had once seemed benign now felt full of secrets, every gully and outcrop a potential hiding place for things better left undiscovered. I was on one of these aimless drives when I realized the truth that I'd been avoiding for months. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved because the knowing doesn't make anything better. I'd found Paddy and brought his killer to justice, but the victory felt hollow. Owen was dead, Paddy was dead, and Larrimah was forever changed. My investigation had answered the question of what happened, but it couldn't address the more fundamental question of why. The red dirt road stretched ahead of me, shimmering in the heat like a mirage. I could keep driving, I realized, pack up my few possessions and leave Larrimah behind. Start fresh somewhere else where the ground didn't hold memories of violence, and the horizon wasn't stained with the knowledge of human frailty. But as I considered it, I knew I wouldn't leave. This place had claimed me, not despite its darkness but because of it. I'd become part of Larrimah's story, just as Paddy and Owen were now part of it. The community, would carry us all forward, the living and the dead, the heroes and the villains. All of us bound together by the simple fact that we'd shared this remote patch of earth and tried to make lives here. I turned the vehicle around and headed back toward town, where Cookie would be preparing for the evening crowd and Barry would be adding new items to his museum's collection. Life would continue because that's what life does. Even in the aftermath of tragedy, we'd tell stories and drink beer and argue about politics and weather. And gradually the sharp edges of our grief would be worn smooth by the passage of time. Paddy Moriarty had vanished from Larrimah one morning, taking his dog and his secrets with him. But his disappearance had revealed something about the rest of us. Our capacity for both good and evil, our ability to deceive and be deceived, our fundamental loneliness despite our proximity to one another. These were uncomfortable,